Academic. And alongside, so the CDLRA, alongside with us doing our emerging technologies survey, Academica Group did a survey as well, and they asked their StudentVu panel very similar questions to us. So as I'm sharing the screen and getting our presentation up, perhaps Rachel or Candice, you can tell us a bit more about Academica Group, what you do, and fill us in a bit.
Absolutely. So I hope you all can hear me. The fan in my office has decided that now is the time to shine. So if you can hear me clearly, we're going well. In a moment here, I'll let Candace speak one or two lines about what the StudentVu panel is specifically, but Academica Group is a market research and consulting firm out of London, Ontario, devoted entirely to Canadian post-secondary education. So on all fronts, what we are trying to do is help higher ed be better, help you to find the programs and the strategies and the operations and everything that will basically make things better. We want to help this sector. And this has been a really interesting year for that, as I know many of you. I'd like to take a quick moment just to acknowledge the challenges and the difficulties that many of you have had to navigate over the past year in particular. And that's part of why we're here. That's why we contributed to the study, is to help shine a light a little bit more on what's going on. In my role, I work as the editor of the Academica Top 10 as well, so I'm responsible for keeping everyone informed about what's going on. Candice, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me as well. The fan is also going off in my office because it's connected to Rachel's. So it's a pleasure to meet everyone today. I'm Candice Carella. I am a senior researcher with Academica Group. I also lead our StudentVu panel. As Rachel mentioned, we have our StudentVu panel, which consists of about 10,000 post-secondary students from across Canada. So it allows us to engage with them in research. They can fill out surveys. They can participate in interview consultations with us. And it's super important to the work that we do to get that student voice. So as part of this research through this survey, we engaged members of our StudentVu panel.
And on the CDLRA front, we are very grateful for Academica Group. Academic Group has been a partner for us since, I think, since we started in 2017, a very long time. One of the things we always were getting asked at CDLRA was for student perspectives on our work, particularly because sometimes we were asking our respondents to share their perceptions of student perspectives. And we were asked, well, what about students themselves? So Candice and Rachel, I'm really grateful for you coming alongside. I think this is the second year now that you've run a StudentVu panel that's parallel to our work, and I'm excited to share these findings. Before we get started too, again, I just want to acknowledge the 2025 Emerging Technologies Survey sponsors and partners. As I mentioned at the top of this, CDLRA is a non-for-profit, and we run completely on the support of our sponsors and partners. So we do thank RisePoint, eCampus Ontario, Campus Manitoba, BC Campus, Academica Group, WCET, Contact North, my consulting practice is a partner as well, and Bayview Analytics for their support in getting this work off the ground and keeping it going year after year. One of the things with doing longitudinal work, it's so important to have funding and support year after year after year, because otherwise, if we don't have that, we lose a moment of time in the data, and it's been fascinating to track these trends over time. So we ran this survey. I will speak to the CDLRA survey, and then Rachel and Candice, if you want to add anything else to about the Academica StudentVu survey, you can. We ran it on the CDLRA side as an online survey. Our primary outreach, we have an email roster, which goes out to about 1,000 people across Canada who are in various different roles at post-secondary institutions. We ran, this survey, sorry, that I realized afterwards the dates are incorrect. So this was our emerging technologies survey, which actually ran from August 17th to October, or it was August 18th to October 17th. So it was this fall. Our other survey this year was those dates. And the response rate, that might be, I realized that might be from our spring survey as well, but it was around I believe it was around 200 as well that we had our respondents for that. So my apologies for that. For our methods, along with our roster, we also post about our survey on social media channels, and our sponsors and partners also share the survey link with their network. And then Rachel, Candace, I'll let you share a bit more about your methods.
Sure. So I'll hop in here. So we ran the survey with our StudentVu panel online, and one thing I'll note that's not written out here is we liked the CDLRA survey so much that we directly stole a bunch of the questions and basically just rewrote them for the students, because to make this comfortable, we wanted to take a look at what the faculty and staff were saying to the CDLRA and take that in front of the students and see if they were reporting something similar. So you'll notice a lot of the questions are very, very similar. The CDLRA came up with them first, so I'll quickly put that out on the line. We ran this online. We do compensate students for all of our surveys, so they receive points that they can then redeem for gift cards, which is very beneficial when working with this group with getting a higher level of complete. So we were able to get about 1,000 responses during our summer survey here. And Candace, are you able to speak to any weighting that would have happened with the results?
Yeah, so we ended up weighting the data by gender according to PCIS data, so the post-secondary student data from Stats Canada, just to ensure that we are accurately representing gender populations.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, and on our end, we get enough of a representation. So we didn't have to do any weighting on the CDLRA side, just because we found over the years our roster really gives us a fairly good representation of different types of institutions, of different people in different roles. About half of our respondents had taught in the last 12 months, and we had respondents from every province and and I think one or two of the territories. So we really do our best at the CDLRA to try to get that full pan-Canadian view here. So sharing the survey results, what everyone's here for. Technology use in the classroom. So on the CDLRA side, we had a list of different technologies, whether it was an online platform, one-on-one videos, and we asked them if they had taught in the past 12 months, our respondents, we asked them to check any technologies used in any of their courses, regardless of how the course is delivered. So this isn't just online courses or hybrid courses. This is courses in any modality. And unsurprisingly, we saw the online platforms like a learning management system is the most common technology used. And then the other common technologies, again, one-to-one video meetings, people became during the pandemic a lot more familiar with Zoom meetings like we're on, or Teams meetings, other kinds of video conferencing. And that does not surprise me as being the second most used technology. After that, we see online polling or quizzes as the top three. And these have been very consistent findings for a number of years now, since we've been running this question. And even pre-pandemic, we saw online platforms like learning management systems being the most used technologies. I think one thing to note about these findings too is when we say use, that still is a very subjective term. So because we have to keep our surveys short, we try to keep our surveys 10 minutes or less. It's hard for us to go in depth in terms of how these are being used. So when someone is using a learning management system, we don't have the data to know whether they're using it on a very surface level, just posting, a syllabus, using it as a way to communicate back and forth with students, or if they are maximizing the different functionalities of the learning management system and using it in a more engaging way. So that's just the one caveat around this data. And I will turn it over to Candace and Rachel to talk about the student side.
Thank you, Nicole. So likewise, on this side, of course, use is a little bit subjective with students as well. And one of the tricky things we run into is we do try to phrase these in ways that students will know what we're talking about. But as I was telling Candace this morning, if you asked me as an 18-year-old, does your class use an LMS? I would have said, I'm not sure, and then signed on to what was then called OWL to find my assignments and things. So we're always kind of navigating that while trying to trade off time. In this case, we see a lot of students recognize and use online polling, recorded lectures for later viewing. The LMS numbers were interesting. We didn't do a formal comparison to last year's results, but we did notice that the LMS usage for connecting with instructors and other students seems to be quite a bit lower this year. And we've seen a couple reports in the media about decreased activity on classroom discussion boards, chats, that sort of thing, as students are turning to other technologies like, say, AI to find answers for things that they otherwise might have asked their peers about. So that's something that we're going to be keeping a little bit of an eye on. And if you happen to have noticed this in your own classrooms, we'd love to hear more about it in the chat to see what's going on with that change. If you can just take us to the next slide there. I think we've got,
Yes.
oh yes, perfect. So the most helpful and least helpful technologies are a pair of questions we like to ask to just see what students find useful in the classroom from their perspective. The recorded lectures for later viewing is far and away the most popular item. Students love to be able to come back to lectures later, followed by having an LMS for interacting with instructors and other students. Excuse me, online polling, quizzes, other sorts of things like that are a little less commonly selected. Students were able to pick up to 3 for this question, so this wasn't a pick absolutely everything. And the less commonly used tools also do, of course, come in a little bit lower.
And I think it's important to note we're going to have a conversation later today with Tara Manick from University College of the North, and that conversation will be specifically on VR and XR technologies. They use VR technologies there. Year after year, that has been I'm not surprised to see it on the bottom of the list. We have seen that in the CDLRA side of VR technologies being at the bottom of the list, and yet it's a conversation that I'm hearing more and more about, people being like, well, there's a lot of potential for use here. Why aren't we using it here? So I'm very curious and to talk with Tara later today and hear her perspectives. And I will say too, with not so much with Candace and Rachel's findings, but with the CDLRA findings, our sample does lean towards people, it does have a bias towards people who are already interested in using digital technologies. So, which makes sense, people who are more likely to follow the work of a digital learning research association, who are more likely to opt into a survey hosted by us, tend to be those who are more interested in digital learning and more likely to be using these technologies. So I've always found it very interesting that even amongst our sample, the those who are using XR technologies it's quite a low number. So just a thought before we move on to, and then I'll let you go back to the least helpful technologies here too. Oh no, we've got,
Yes,
yes, yeah, we got those.
yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, it's one of those interesting topics where it's one of those technologies that you don't just bring in on Monday morning and figure out in front of the class. So there's also an element of a little bit higher of an entry. I'm going to say entry cost, but I mean that not just in terms of finance, but also time, skill, that sort of thing. And any technology, one of the things that frequently comes up in the comments from these students, a technology that's poorly deployed is not going to be well received, of course. So there is always also that question of how do you do it well if you're going to do it? On the least helpful technologies for learning or understanding the course material, this was basically drawn from everything they said had been used in their courses. So there is, it is no surprise that online tools to ensure academic integrity, so that's like Proctor, those kinds of tools, of course, ranks the highest. It's not something that has a direct impact typically on learning. It's more of a deterrent to avoiding learning. But so we take that one with a grain of salt. But the small group asynchronous activities, student speeches, small group asynchronous activities, a lot of kind of those student group work aspects that are done online tended to come up fairly high. And the online polling, even though it was one of the higher ones on the previous chart, I believe, in this one, there's some students who don't like it, who didn't find it very helpful. But 49% said that of the technologies used in their classroom, none of them are really not helpful. So that is a positive aspect for how these technologies are being used in class.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see that, especially from that student perspective there.
Just want to chime in quickly. I saw that Russell dropped a question about, did we have any questions or feedback about the use of technologies outside of the institutional approved tools? Have
Mhm.
heard worries from institution leadership about not being able to track quality, accessibility, and privacy concerns when faculty use other tools. So from the student survey side, I don't believe we had any questions about like technologies outside of those approved. We just provided them with that list of potential technologies used in the classroom, and that's what they were going off of. But it is a good question to ask, possibly for future surveys.
Mhm. It starts to drift into, for our survey at least, and Nicole, then I'll pass it over to you for your survey. One of the tricky things with surveying students is you can only reasonably ask students things that they could reasonably know, and I'm not sure that the average student would be fully aware of what constitutes an institutionally approved tool. So there is also there's a little bit of a blind aspect of would the average student have the knowledge to discern that as well. So it's a very interesting question. Nicole, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, we haven't had much in the way like on from my vantage point about the use of, outside, except I would say when it comes to AI, which we'll of course be talking about in a second, and concerns about, different AI platforms, the security of that, how people are using that AI. When it comes to other technologies, I haven't seen that be an issue. But of course, those of you who are here and working in post-secondary, if you've had a different experience, please let us know in the chat. We'd love to hear about that. But no, that hasn't been something that's been a big issue that's come up for us, is the use of technologies outside of institutionally approved tools. I think what I'm hearing more is more the opposite, with this wanting people to be using more technologies. And again, I would say the one exception to that, of course, is AI. All right. And speaking of AI, let's move into some questions on that. So on the CDLRA side, this is we've asked this question now for a couple years. So I will be releasing for those of you who are in the LinkedIn group, and again, I'll make sure everyone here has access to it. You would have received a link in the emails for this event, but I will make sure at the end of the day too to be posting that group. I will be posting within the next, week or so in the LinkedIn group, the sort of early snapshots and briefs that show the CDLRA's longitudinal comparison of this data, the year to year. But we're not seeing anything that is overly different this year than what we've seen in the past. Certainly, there's just tensions that exist around the use of AI. So we actually see really strong agreement that students will use Gen AI as a study tool, and a very high expectation that within a few years, Gen AI use will be a normal part of education. So I was in a meeting yesterday with a group of people talking about AI, and one of the faculty members there, said it feels like a fire hose that, is just knocking us over, and it just keeps going. It's not ever going to turn off. And how do we keep track of it, because it's just becoming more and more prevalent. And I think that's a common sentiment that's being felt across the sector. And certainly, we had a lot of our respondents agree as well that Gen AI will make teaching more challenging. Many times that does come in with the academic integrity side, as you can see. Our respondents were again mostly in agreement that students will use Gen AI to cheat. But there was a small, a little bit over half of our respondents did agree to some extent that Gen AI will make teaching more efficient. Um, we had, a good minority who thought it would make it more effective. And same thing with the engaging part of it. So we're seeing those tensions surrounding AI, this understanding that it's here to stay. It's going to become a normal part of things. It has potential as a study tool. Uh, it also has potential to make teaching a lot more challenging, and this sort of wrestling with what do we do with AI. And then we asked how our respondents were using Gen AI tools. So those who had taught in the last 12 months, we asked them the ways that they're using it. And in many cases, it is being used as a tool. So to support administrative tasks, to generate course assessment tools, rubrics, multiple choice questions, generate course content, And then there is a minority of respondents as well, about a quarter, who are using it to support research work with data collection and analysis, a few who are using it to support scholarly writing. Not too many who are using it to create assignments or activities that require students to use Gen AI, and very few are using it to input work into Gen AI applications for assessment. So again, it's just that administrative work that we are seeing. That's where we're seeing it used the most on our end, which doesn't surprise me in the least. So turning it over to Candace and Rachel again.
Sure. Thank you, Nicole. So I wanted to actually quickly go back to slide 9 because I realized there was one point on there I was
Oh, sure.
planning
Yes.
to touch on quickly, and the AI discussion just reminded me of it. Um, One thing we wanted to ask about is, so if the faculty believe they have a certain level of grasp around generative AI, what do students see from the classroom seats? And that top bar there was particularly interesting to us. So about 70% um, basically agreed that in 2024 to 25, their instructors were clarifying their expectations around the use of generative AI. And that was one of the really important points we wanted to dip into, because there were a lot of questions that we saw previous years in other surveys and comments about students experiencing a situation where they did not know what their instructors expected them to do or not do, whether it was a blanket ban, whether certain situations were acceptable. And so we heard from a couple of folks working in academic integrity that it was a question mark. Students were not aware they had done anything wrong, and they were coming in with generated material. So this, I thought, was very important to see that students are seeing their faculty clarifying their expectations around the use of generative AI. So if we pull back forward to the next bar graph here, what did students think about these aspects? How is AI going to change things in the classroom? And I think one of the most interesting ones to compare, Nicole, between your data and our data is, will students use Gen AI to cheat? I think the faculty are being a touch nicer about it than the students are about each other. So the students said, yeah, I think they will, but also it can be a study tool. And over the next few years, they are expecting it. About half of them are expecting it to become a normal part of education. It's a tricky thing to imagine kind of what that's going to look like. And so I'm glad we've got so many experts here to talk about that and how we're seeing it play out. Uh, so that's what I wanted to quickly touch on there.
And then we've got something on policies here too that you would ask students about too.
Yeah, so we did ask students as well if any of their instructors had an official policy on how to use generative AI or platforms in the classroom. And this is important, because when you've got a policy in place, there's no room for confusion. There's not as much, well, there's always room for confusion and misunderstanding, but there's far less when you have a policy in place. And so just shy of 2/3 said that their instructors, at least one of them, had an official policy about how to use these tools or platforms. 17% couldn't remember, but that 2/3 is very handy. The 20%, I think, is what we would like to see decrease, because when you have that communication, it's simpler for students to navigate the classroom.
Yeah, that's very interesting here too. I did recently, outside of my work with CDLRA, an environmental scan on AI policies in Canadian post-secondary education. And in many cases, the policies were put up in 2023, but hadn't been updated, and were very simplistic in terms of just cheating, but didn't necessarily capture the nuances and how AI has evolved over the years. So I find that to be really interesting as well. And then we have the approved platforms for students as well.
Yeah, so this was interesting. We asked about the platforms that had been approved, what they were allowed to use. So ChatGPT and Grammarly were far and away the most common, followed by Copilot. I also see Brian Lorraine's comment in the chat about the environmental cost of generative AI and technology. And it is one of those interesting things where when we are looking into some of these platforms, they're not all equal in terms of the cost to run them, the companies behind them, what they're doing. And so I think that's part of the consideration, is what's being approved and then what's inherent also in that approval. One in
Yeah.
10, nothing was allowed. So that was also an interesting piece to have come in.
That I was going to say too, just to Brian's comment, yeah, that that conversation I think is really important as well. The ecological costs, I'm seeing that come up a lot more. That was something when I did my environmental scan with those who had updated their policies since 2023 were in most cases mentioning something that's at the institutional level, were mentioning something about environmental impact and sustainability and the ecological impact of AI because we know that it uses a lot. And I think there are some AI companies, I believe, again, in looking through that, like Microsoft, who with their Copilot is looking at ways to reduce their impact. Whether or not we would say that that's, low impact right now is debatable, but I think it's certainly institutions are keeping an eye on that for sure.
And then further to this front, what are students feeling about AI? Do they have any concerns about its use in the classroom? It's a bit of a divide. This is a bit of a divisive topic. So 35% yes, 40% no, 25% not sure. That's a pretty divided classrooms. Not all students are in the same place about this technology, which I know we're also seeing with the faculty and staff. So I think it's one of those things that's important to remember when we're talking about all these aspects about what are the feelings towards generative AI, who wants to use it, who doesn't want to use it. There's been some fabulous articles from students themselves, like one in Maclean's recently, about what it feels like to be a student who either is in favor or against this technology. And both sides feel an element of disadvantage in terms of how they're perceived. So that's a very interesting aspect.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. So the last thing we talked about, moving on from it, there's, and I think I just noticing Neil's conversation too in the chat as well. I think using the word cheat creates a problematic view of the use of AI. Most students would see it as efficient. Yeah, and I think it's sort of as the shifts happens between it becoming as a more of a tool. I think as we see more classrooms take, where instructors are giving clear statements or policies or guidelines around its use, then I think it's a mentality shift that on both sides for everyone to see it as how do we use it as a tool to enhance learning versus that just using it means students are cheating. And I do think we have a ways to go there. But Neil, that I think that's a very good and interesting point that you made there.
I
So
agree, and I'd like to quickly piggyback on that as well. It's one of those interesting developments we're seeing where part of the choice of the language there actually came from student comments themselves and the way that they were discussing it, to basically see was that a shared perspective. Cheating with AI, as Nicole said, it's a moving conversation about is this a tool, and I think there are students who will see all usage of it as cheating, and maybe that needs to be walked back a bit. The trade-off being, all tools, if they are neutral, can be used to cheat, can be used to learn. You can have a piece of paper become a cheating tool if you write answers on it and sneak it into an exam, right? And so I think the aspect of understanding what's permissible and what's helpful with any tool is a very important part of the conversation. So it is going to get more nuanced, and there are tricky aspects with the words that we use, but it's all part of the development too.
yeah, I fully agree with that. And it's knowing what is cheating and what's not, and that's with AI. And I think it's when you've got different faculty members with different perspectives at an institution, especially if there isn't a clear blanket institutional policy, then that can make it confusing for students too, because they don't just have one instructor. Typically, they've got multiple who might have very different views and opinions on AI use. So switching gears to look at the future, we've asked this question now. I think this might be it's definitely the third, if not the fourth year that the CDLRA has asked this question. We started asking this during the pandemic when the world had kind of turned upside down and people who had very little previous experience with online learning, with digital learning, hybrid, all of a sudden were, thrown into this world when the Canadian sector was moved online for the better part of, a year and a half. And it was interesting to see the perceptions of the future over time. We still see it's really interesting. And of course, once sort of the dust began to settle a bit from the pandemic, then generative AI popped up into our world, which also then impacted feelings of the future. So we saw in sort of the pandemic years, the feelings of the future being very related to technology use and to online learning and what this disruptor is going to be, to now a lot of the comments that we have surrounding these questions and our open-ended responses really relate more to AI and, evolving technologies more so than just online learning versus in-person learning. We still see the majority of our respondents expecting, a different future. Very few, 2%, expecting it to stay the same as now. Um, it's interesting to see that almost a third of our respondents expect that in 5 years' time, which is not that far away, post-secondary education to be very different than the present. So when we ask this question, we have our respondents think about today in 2025, 5 years later from now, how different is this going to be? And so to see that it's, a third expect it to be very different and about a half expect it to be somewhat different, I think is a very interesting finding that amongst our respondents, this change that we've been experiencing for quite some time now is still expected to continue. And then we always ask this as well, because we want to know whether people expect change, but you know, are they feeling ready for this change that will happen? So I've see this really interesting because we have this expectation for change, but we also have this readiness or somewhat readiness for change. We had very few respondents who said no, they weren't ready for the changes that the future might bring to their institution. And again, even fewer who said they weren't sure. But just over a quarter said, yeah, they're ready for the changes. And just over half said they're somewhat ready, which corresponds to things being somewhat different and being somewhat ready for it. And then we asked our respondents whether they felt optimistic or pessimistic about the future of overall future of higher ed over the next few years. A couple years ago, we ran this as well with the US, with some US counterparts, and had a US comparison point. And we found at that point in time, Canadians were far more optimistic than Americans. I would be curious to run that survey again now with so much that has happened since we last ran that. But we still are seeing, a minority, a strong minority who say that they're very optimistic or at least optimistic about the future. If they're not feeling optimistic, then they're more likely feeling neutral. And then the level of pessimism is about a quarter of our respondents are feeling pessimistic about the future and these changes that they perceive are coming our way. And then students, Rachel and Candace, I'll let you speak about what what your students thought about that.
Sure. So, Candace, I'll let you jump in here in a moment if you have anything you'd like to add. But one of the things we love to do is open up the comments box to students to hear directly from them in their words about what they're thinking. So we asked them, how do they think post-secondary education will change over the next 5 years? And it was very interesting in terms of what they see, and a lot of their focus was on AI itself. How is AI going to change the way that information is taught, the way that it's used to monitor academic integrity, the way that assessments will happen? So some students talked about things moving to more reading and writing right in class, as opposed to take-home exams or online quizzes. And also just the question of whether post-secondary education would keep up with the technological change, which I think is one of those discussions that's been happening off the corner inside of everyone's desk as well, is can higher ed keep up with what's going on in AI?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add on to that is what I found interesting was the comments surrounding like assessment methods and assignments. For example, the students saying there will be more AI proof assessment methods in class, like oral exams, for example. So it's just interesting to see that students are seeing that the way in which they'll be assessed should be shifting. And yeah, it leads to a lot of questions for instructors as well on what that might look like for different forms of classes.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting points. I think, again, outside of the CDLRA work that I do, one of the things that I'm really hearing coming up with AI, particularly from um, a student perspective, but also a workforce readiness perspective, is how are students going to be using technologies in the workforce, and what does that mean for how they need to be integrating it into their, their work and how their assessment. So I think that's a really interesting point there too, that, the students thinking that there's going to be more AI proof assessment methods. And I would say that I'm hearing similar sentiments on, from the institutional side of things. And yet, then sort of how the tension that exists between what students are going to be expected to do in the workforce and talking to people who are, in industry and having conversations with people who are CEOs or in leadership of different organizations, saying, they're hesitant to hire someone who doesn't have strong AI or technology skills right now, because that's exactly where they're going in the workforce. So I think there's some interesting tensions that certainly exist in here. So yeah, I think this is sort of our concluding thoughts. This was, I know for me, this came out of the survey, the CDLRA side, that AI is expected to become a normal part of education. Again, potential as a study tool, but it's expected to make teaching more challenging. And I think these tensions that we've described and come up with are, very much some of the reasons why it's challenging. Because what do we do with this technology that students probably do need to use, but we also need them to able to assess that they're reaching some certain standards, for just quality and accreditation purposes, for at institutions, much less, the whole point of educating people to reach their full potential and to be, to master a subject area and to be qualified to work in this, the space that they're studying to work in. Again, faculty using AI to support administrative tasks like, course, they're not using AI in, wildly creative ways, but really just to help with efficiencies and getting jobs done. And then lastly, what we've seen for years is that on the CDLRA side, online platforms like learning management systems are the most commonly used technology, again, followed by one-on-one video meetings and online polling and quizzes. So with that, we've got our contact information there. Mine will show up again a few times throughout this, but Rachel's is here as well, and you can sign up for the Academica Top 10 newsletter. I know many of us in this space get that, and I know that's one thing that I look at pretty much every morning. Is That's one of the ways that I get my news for what's happening in this space, is through the Academica Top 10. And then if you're not on the CDLRA list, we always put a QR code up, and this will add you to our roster. If you aren't yet receiving invitations for our surveys, if you scan the QR code, then you will be added to that list.
Wonderful.
And yeah, and it was asked, I think, whether we will share the slides. Absolutely. So I will make sure the slides get out to attendees. I'll put them access to them in our LinkedIn group. I will send them out. I can send them out to attendees via email as well, but we will make sure that they get to that.
And I just wanted to take a quick moment here to extend a very warm thank you to the CDLRA team and you, Nicole, for letting us run some of these questions by our students and see what's going on, because we love to be able to get all of these perspectives in one place and see what's going on, because this technology that's affecting, changing higher ed, these changes affect everyone involved with it, from the most senior leader to the brand new student who's just arrived on campus for the first time. So thank you, CDLRA, for shining a light on this, and thank you for letting us be a part of it.
Well, and thank you again. For years, we've been asked, well, what do students themselves think about this? What are student perspectives? And we are really grateful for the past 2 years to actually be able to team up and to be able to spotlight those student perspectives from the surveys that you find. And for that reason, we love that you take the questions exactly as we have them in some cases, or just adapt them slightly so they're understandable for students, so that we've got that comparative point. Um, I see in the chat too, Marlene, you had asked, is there a site for this survey to share? Um, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure that I'm clear on what you're asking. When we do have um, when the survey is up and going, that goes to our roster and we have it posted on our website and stuff like that. Right now, we don't have a survey open, so there isn't that. With that said, I'll be putting together a few short research briefs. So we've already put out our Pan-Canadian report from our first survey that the CDLRA did this year, but I will be putting together a few briefs that give the longitudinal comparisons. I will be posting those in the LinkedIn group probably within the next week or so, that just have those year-to-year comparisons on the topics of AI, technology use, and feelings about the future. Those will also be posted on the CDLRA website. And on the CDLRA website, yes, Russ, thank you for putting that in the chat. We've got publications. Yes, website would be good. So absolutely, yes, to talk about it with others. So on our publications page, that's where you'll find all of our publications from years past. For that. And I will be putting up again on the CDLRA site to a blog post that does have links to all these videos, and again, so that you can get the materials from this. Everything that we do at CDLRA, we try to do keep it very open and accessible at low cost or no cost to anyone. Hence this technology symposium was no cost, because we want to make our work as accessible to be able to get to as many people as possible. With that said, I will ask, does anyone have any questions of us? Joanne, I'll ask you to, I know you were following in the chat to see if there's questions for us as we went along.
Yeah, I don't see any that were unanswered as of yet. A lot of great discussion about some of the terminology and all of those other things. If I can add one question from my perspective, this is really prescient information for me, as like last night I was teaching my last academic writing class of the term at the University of Winnipeg, and just was reflecting on sort of how things have changed over the 15 years that I've been teaching that same class, and to those first year students. And so I've seen a shift over time because of the technology, for many of the reasons that you've mentioned and some of the things that you've indicated. And I guess I really love this idea that we're asking both the institutions and instructors as well as students. I'm wondering if there's any thought that you have to sort of how we bridge this conversation. So we've seen the results from both groups, let's say. I'm just wondering if you've given thought to the future in terms of like bringing those groups together and facilitating some kind of conversation, or thinking about how we, especially as some instructors are maybe, bridging that time from like little technology to now a lot of technology in terms of AI, and how we maybe then sort of bridge that conversation with students and think about that. So I know that was a lot in a question, but I was kind of thinking about, sort of how we bring these two worlds together. I mean, we do it in the classroom, but is there any research that you're thinking about in terms of that?
Yeah, I'll answer, and then Rachel, if you can, if you want to too. I think that's a great idea. I would love to see some sort of I don't know who would be interested in financing that or facilitating that. But I would love to see some sort of like symposium or in-person opportunity or virtual opportunity where we could bring, our students and people who are working at institutions, whether it be faculty, administrators, together from multiple institutions, not just people who they're familiar with the culture within their institution, to have these broader conversations, because I think that would be very valuable. I had not thought of that, but I think that it's a really good idea. Rachel, any thoughts from you?
I second that. I think that would be a fascinating thing to get into, and I'd love to hear that because I mean I can share my perspective on what I think students are saying all day long, and Candace and I have access right to that data, but hearing it right from the students in response to one another is so helpful. So we do share the results back with the students. So we don't leave them in the dark after we ask them surveys. We let them know what everybody said. So there's a little bit of that share back, but one thing I'll add is you mentioned having those conversations in the classroom, and I'd say keep doing it. Like one of the most important results in this survey from the student perspective was that instructors are talking about this in the classroom. It's not a hush hush hidden topic. And even when you are having that conversation for the 100th time, many of those students will be hearing it for the first. And I think that's so important to hold on to that, one of the conversation points in the chat there was about like, if there's no clear policies, how do you know what constitutes cheating or what does constitute cheating beyond just your institution wide broad terms around what is academic integrity? Um, Having those conversations makes it fairer for everyone and can bring people on the same page of the why, why do these issues matter? So that's my, keep going, keep doing it. All of you who are talking about it, keep doing it.
Yeah,
Thanks so
definitely.
much.
If there's no other questions, I see that we're at 9 o'clock, and so we have it scheduled on the agenda. And that's one thing I didn't do at the very beginning, an overview of the day, but I will give a quick update of sort of what we're doing for the day now for those of you here. So we've got a half an hour for breaks